Welcome back. New York City is one of the few places in America with right to shelter laws, which means that anyone who comes here and goes to a specific city facility by a certain time has to be sheltered by the next morning. However, for many migrants coming to New York City, this task can be a challenge. Joining me to discuss their journey through New York City shelter systems is Amir Khafagy, member of Report America and labor reporter for DocumentedNY. Amir, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, I mentioned this a little bit, but you wrote an article with Julia. Can you just talk about what prompted the both of you to write this article following a migrant's journey through the New York City shelter system?
Well, being documented in New York is the only newsroom in New York City that focuses on the immigrant experience in New York. There's a lot of other immigrant newspapers and news outlets in New York, but it's the only news outlet that focuses on the entirety of the immigrant experience in New York, regardless of where they country of origin are. And given the fact that New York City is a city of immigrants, and we have a lot of reach within different immigrant communities and throughout the city, we realized that it was really important for us to cover one of the most important migrant or immigration crises that's taking place in the city at this moment. We were hearing reports from community organizations and mutual aid groups such as the South Bronx Mutual Aid Organization that many of the migrants that were coming from Texas, that were being sent here from Texas to New York, were not being given adequate shelter, or they were facing a myriad of issues that was taking place within the shelter system, and that they didn't have the support that they desperately needed. So hearing that, we realized that Julie and I realized that it was important for us to really cover the story in a way that probably wasn't being covered anywhere else.
Now, I talked about it a little bit, but can you tell us a little bit more about the right to shelter laws that we have here in New York City and what that means for so many migrant families?
Well, I'm not an expert in the right to shelter laws, but what I do know is anybody who needs shelter in New York City the city is required by law to give them that shelter. So you can show up, theoretically, you can show up at any of the city shelters or city homeless intake centers, and you cannot be denied city shelter. And I know this dates back to a court case in which the courts ruled that the city had to provide shelter for anyone who is in need. So it's unique. Not many cities have such a I don't want to call it a program, but they don't have such a stipulation. So many of the migrants who are coming into New York, and I think it's almost now nearly 8,000 migrants and growing, are coming from buses from Texas, and they're now entering a system that is overburdened and overtaxed, a system that was barely functioning to begin with, but now the migrant crisis has really brought to a head how poorly run and how poorly functioning the city shelter system is.
So in this article, we can see that you actually, spoke to a few of the migrants, and two of them were Jorge and Alexandra, and they explained that they were actually turned away after being admitted into a shelter. Why is this happening to so many migrant families right now?
Well, Julia was able to speak to those particular migrants because she had noticed that they were kind of camped out at a city park not far from, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it was the 30th Street shelter in the east side of Manhattan. And in their particular case, they found the shelters to be dangerous. And that's very interesting. If they found the shelters to be dangerous and unsafe, you gotta remember, these migrants came from a journey that probably took 3 months, right? They came from Venezuela through the jungles of the Darien Gap, which is between Panama and Colombia, and is very notoriously dangerous, and came through Central America to Mexico, then to Texas, and then all the way to New York, a very dangerous journey. Julie spoke to one mother whose child died along that journey. And yet to find that the city shelter systems were too dangerous for them, is indicative of the problem of the shelter system. But of other couples, married couples, who are going into the city shelters, they're having a tough time because um, they don't have the proper paperwork to show or to prove that they're married, and the city shelters require couples to have the proper paperwork to go into to be able to be sheltered together. So that's a red bureaucratic formality that existed prior to this migrant crisis. But now the migrants are coming from countries where they don't have the proper paperwork, they don't have it on them. They just went through this extraordinary journey, and now they're being denied shelter together, or they have to travel really far to go to a shelter at the last minute that might take them, and that's a big might. So some families are preferring to sleep on the street together than to be separated in these shelters. So the city has to really do something to ensure that these migrants families are able to stay together despite paperwork and documentation or whatever.
Now, you talked about the threat of separation, and how it applies to couples, but does this also apply to maybe mothers and children, or a dad with his children? How are these people facing the threat of separation?
Well, we're hearing on the ground that many of the men are being separated right off the bat. They're not being allowed to be sheltered with their families. That's something we've been hearing on the ground, and that seems to be a big problem. But also, we're hearing on the ground that aunts and uncles aren't being able to stay together. So larger family units are being separated. Um, Again, this is something that we're hearing anecdotally on the ground. We haven't had hard evidence that shows that this is something that is happening, but we've spoken to enough people to feel like this is something that is occurring. And we're also hearing it from community groups and the different mutual aid groups that are working with the migrants. So it seems to be a larger problem. And the city has said that they will address it. First, the city's sending a mixed message, right? At one end, we're hearing that families aren't being separated. And then on the other hand, we're hearing, yes, well, if it does happen, we're going to address it. This shouldn't be. And I think a lot of this could be fixed if the city were able to create an intake center that addressed the specific needs of the migrants coming into the city right now. And the city has said that they were going to do this, and several weeks have gone by, and we still don't know any details of whether or not they're going to create a specific intake center for the migrants coming in from Texas.
Now, this entire situation is part of a larger issue. As ABC reports, Texas Governor Greg Abbott is sending these migrant families to Democrat-run cities as a way to pressure President Joe Biden to crack down at the border. What are your thoughts on this, and what could be the long-term repercussions of an action like this?
Well, obviously, the Texas governor is using these vulnerable population, these migrant people coming from Texas, as pawns in a political game for his own his own hopes to become president one day, right? He's using them and to boost his own image, and inherently it's a racist tactic, right? Because these are mostly immigrants of color trying to come to the border and trying to come to America for some semblance of a better life, and to be given this one-way bus ticket to New York. And many of them don't have any connections to New York. They don't have families in New York. They don't even know why they're going to New York. Is completely cruel, it's wrong, and it's racist right off the bat. But we also have to ask ourselves, why are we having such a big migrant crisis at the border right now? Many of the families we spoke to, and many of the families that are coming in to New York, and the migrants coming into New York, are refugees from Venezuela, and many are fleeing Venezuela because of the harsh economic realities in Venezuela. That's a result of no small part to the sanctions we've imposed on Venezuela. So we're seeing a national issue, we're seeing a local issue, but we're seeing an international issue that's directly tied to economic, international foreign policy. So there wouldn't be a big migrant crisis at the border right now if there wasn't so detrimental sanctions imposed on Venezuela that's harming its economy. And then we're seeing, when the migrants do come, we're seeing them used as political pawns boost the Texas governor's national profile, and that's completely wrong. And then we're seeing them when they finally come to the city is not prepared to handle them, because the city is barely prepared to handle the economic refugees that we have in this city who can't afford the rents in this city. They can't, that are displaced because of the high rents, displaced because of many of the fires that are occurring. Some are still displaced from Hurricane Ida just last year, and so the city's social safety net has been in disrepair for many years, and this is putting great pressure on an already fragile system. And hopefully, this can expose how fragile the system was to begin with, and how we can make greater change and to reform the system.
Now, you wrote a really, with a partner, you wrote a really great article. Where can people go to actually read that article and learn more about this in detail?
You could read our article, Julia's and I's article on Documented New York, as well as many other fantastic and amazing articles by a fantastic group of staff writers and as well as freelance writers on DocumentedNY.org.
All right. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed this interview.
We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.